This story will be about two lovers, about a girl with big, green, naive eyes and red hair, and a young man thirsting for revenge, with a gaze filled with pain, hatred, and coldness. This pair looked very harmonious. They seemed to complement each other. The young man sat in someone's embrace, looking tired and hearing someone praying to God. Most likely, it was the person whose arms were wrapped around the young man. His gaze was fixed on the door that someone was banging on with great force, as if it was about to fly off its hinges. In the tired eyes of the boy, a cross was already visible, but he still continued to hear prayers for blessings. The sounds coming from the door, which was being pounded, grew louder and louder. He was still sitting in the person's embrace. Under the table, pressed close to each other, as if trying to protect themselves from all the horrors in the world, sat the boy and the woman. It was possibly during that dark time that the boy realized it for the first time. And what he realized, we will find out a little later. The door crumbled with a crash. The woman started calling the boy Hale, and in turn, the boy called her Mom. It was as if they were saying goodbye, and tears welled up in the boy's eyes, trying with all his might not to let go of his mother's hand on his face. As she left, the woman asked the boy to remember that she would always love him. And as she was leaving from under the table, leaving her son there, considering it the safest place, she almost forcibly pulled her hand away from his grip. The boy cried and screamed in fear. And now let's return to what this boy felt for the first time during that dark period. He felt that a sad end awaited all his loved ones. Beneath his feet was a framed photograph of him, his dad, and his mom. Shouts were heard. The boy, looking at all this with tear-filled eyes, could not believe what was happening. The boy's mother was asking for something, not just asking, but pleading, but she was not allowed to finish. She fell silent. The boy, sitting under the table, had already covered his ears and eyes. His mother's bloodied hand appeared in front of him. It's not hard to guess what happened, but even though he knew about his curse, his greedy heart still longed for warmth. Everything described was like a dream to him, or rather, memories that appeared in his dream. So, when our hero opened his eyes, he felt a gentle touch on his cheek. The owner of this hand gently asked if he had another nightmare. Above our hero was a brunette with straight hair. She had pleasant features and a very caring gaze. She assured our hero that nothing terrible would happen because she was there for him. After a while, we can see the same girl standing on the edge of some structure above the sea during the dark hours. Her shoes were already floating in the water. Our hero hoped that happiness would last forever, but, as if mocking this misconception, on the edge of that structure, a man in a burgundy suit was holding this girl. The girl asked our hero for help, but he couldn't do anything as two thugs were holding him back. In his gaze, one could observe the same horror as at the moment when they killed his mother. He yelled the girl's name and begged them to stop. No one listened to him. The girl was in panic, tears streaming down her eyes. She cried that she didn't want to die like this, as a gun was pointed to her temple and delicate hands were twisted behind her back. Just a couple of moments after those words, a bullet entered the girl's head, and blood splattered in all directions, and the young lady fell backward. Her killer viciously grinned with satisfaction. Hale stared in horror at this, and realized that his hope had been shattered to pieces, once again reminding him of the cursed fate. He watched as the killer threw the body of the dead girl in a white nightgown into the sea. She flew, and her dress and hair fluttered in the wind, while the man in the red suit observed the scene. The beaten youth was still held in the grips of the two thugs, who stood on either side of him. He looked desperately at the man in red and could barely grasp what was being said to him, which was that all this happened because our hero had stepped out of line. Standing like a ruler over our hero, the thug in the red suit pressed the gun to the boy's forehead and whispered to him that loneliness suits him better. Moments later, numerous shots rang out among those houses, or rather on the seashore. Sometime later, our hero walked along a concrete wall, and his shadow was visible on it. In his mouth, the young man held a cigarette, and there was a bloodstain on the wall. He understood that from now on, he would never let anyone close to him again. He left the alley where countless bloody dead bodies lay, clearly killed by our hero. Hale seemed to make a vow to dedicate his entire existence solely to revenge. Arriving at a specific location, the young man began to reload his pistol. His clothes were all smeared with something. Inhaling tobacco and closing his eyes with pleasure, the young man reasoned that, as he had thought, he was finally ready to meet his maker. But then, some girl with red hair started shouting for him not to go there. In front of him stood a green-eyed, red-haired girl who held his hand with the gun and yelled that he couldn't die. She looked very concerned and clearly did not want our hero to be harmed in any way. And he just looked at her with confusion. The girl was almost crying as she ordered him not to die. Her big green eyes were fixed on him, and she kept repeating that Hale must live. He looked at her with bewilderment and apprehension. He still had a glowing cigarette in his mouth, and his face was smeared with blood. Our hero tried to understand how he could have mistaken her for that red-haired girl. They both froze. She stood there, holding his hand and looking straight into his eyes, while he leaned slightly, trying to find answers to his questions in her eyes. You couldn't tear your gaze away from hers. And what happened next? We will find out very soon. The girl lay on the floor amid scattered items, looking very pleased, and our hero, as if protecting her from all danger, leaned over the young lady. In one hand, he held a pistol, and in the other, a glowing cigarette. On a beautiful sunny day in one of the city's assignments, a cheerful greeting was heard. A redhead girl with big green eyes entered the room. In one hand, she held a little basket, and with the other, she supported a bag hanging from her shoulder. She cheerfully exclaimed to those present that she had returned. One of the young men in the room even jumped with joy and, looking at this heroine, exclaimed in surprise, and then repeated that she had returned, while another man sitting nearby, engrossed in looking at the computer monitor, didn't pay any attention to the girl and merely congratulated her on her return. The girl, blushing, asked those present to guess what the client gave her. The guy standing nearby looked at all this with amusement, just like the redhead girl. Some of the others still didn't pay any attention to all this. And then, a moment later, the girl began to show the basket with fortune cookies. Her happiness knew no bounds, as if she were a child seeing this wonder for the first time. The girl enthusiastically repeated that they were free, given to customers as part of a promotional campaign, and offered everyone present to grab some by passing the basket around. The young man holding the basket admired her. In one instant, her eyes widened, and she started thinking about something, gazing somewhere in the distance. Looking at the empty space among her colleagues, she asked those present where Hale was. Some didn't even notice her. All the people were engrossed in the fortune cookies. But one of the employees wearing glasses, while trying to crack open a cookie to get his fortune, lazily looked at the girl and said that our hero had just gone out for a smoke. After a moment's thought, he added that he had gone out to smoke 2 hours ago. Just a second ago, the lovely redhead turned into an angry girl, and the cookies in her hand crumbled with a crack as she squeezed them with her hands, the dentist's unnoticed. Her indignation knew no bounds. She tried to understand how he could have gone out to smoke for 2 whole hours. During this time, her fortune from the cookie, which said, "You will discover a new side of someone familiar. Be cautious," flew to the floor. This prediction hit the nail on the head. Our hero approached the task, where a sign saying closed was visible. He stood there, leisurely puffing on his cigarette, as if pondering his course of action. And after a little thought, he threw the cigarette away, and exhaling the last puffs of smoke, confidently headed towards the building from where laughter could be heard. Approaching the window, he heard a plea that someone would do whatever is necessary. In the middle of the room, a young man knelt before the guys who were laughing and trying to figure out if this was all real. Then they began to call him a good guy and assured him that they knew he wanted to live. In this room was the man in the red suit who killed our hero's beloved. He was sitting on the couch, sipping something, while gleefully watching the scene unfold. The kneeling guy had his eyes blindfolded, and then they started saying that they urgently needed our negative liver and heart. Tears rolled down the guy's cheeks, and he pleaded for mercy. One of the abductors, taunting the blindfolded guy, began to speak, pointing to one of the targets, that if he hit it, they would let him go. He cursed and added that they would even give him an extension to repay his debt. All this, of course, if he hit the center of the target. I remind you, his eyes were blindfolded. And then the merry bandit handed the young man a dart while he was praying to anyone who would listen. With trembling hands and sobs, he lifted the dart and tried to aim. Although, how could he aim if he couldn't see? And the villains yelled at him to go all out. And a second later, something flew towards the target. It wasn't a dart. It was a knife that struck the bullseye of the dartboard. Everyone present was puzzled, and the blindfolded boy even staggered backward. The man in the maroon suit tried to figure out what was going on. They all collectively stared at the door where a man was standing. The door creaked open, and with laughter, our hero entered the room. Closing the door behind him, he asked everyone present why the hell they all gathered here in broad daylight. Throughout this time, he kept his hand on the doorknob. Then, locking the door, he wearily stated that all this nonsense was damn tiring. Walking through the room, he lowered his head and heard everything they said to him. He repeated his initial question, trying to understand what the hell they were up to, and one of the thugs couldn't hold back and shouted after him, inquiring who he was. The guy probably wanted to say something, but didn't get a chance as our hero slit the throat of this adversary. Having done that, Hale tried to understand why these people couldn't just sit in their office like normal folks. Looking at all this, the other villains were horrified and tried to comprehend what just happened. As he threw away the dead man's body with a cut throat, he glared angrily at the others and continued the sentence he had started. And the gist of it was that if they had stayed in the office, he wouldn't have had to look for them. One of the adversaries pointed a gun at our hero, who used the dead body as a shield and ordered to kill him. But the young man was much faster, and so within seconds, he lunged with a knife at the thugs coming at him. He tossed away the dead body. This body fell on the guy with the gun, while another thug received a knife in the forehead. Nobody expected such a turn of events. Hale picked up a long structure and flew at the adversaries. With this structure, he knocked the guns out of the thugs' hands. Nobody expected this, so it gave our hero an advantage. Our hero started scattering these people left and right without even blinking. His movements were so precise that one might think he had practiced on them or had a specific plan in his head. All you could see was blood flying in different directions. During this time, the blindfolded guy didn't take off his blindfold, but sat at the table and tried to cover his ears to avoid hearing all this horror. After some time, the shadow of our hero fell near the dead bodies. Without much thought, the young man grabbed the man in the red suit by his tie and began dragging him somewhere while the man cursed. Our hero dragged him to the stage, but why? The man in red ordered him to let him go. He tried to defend himself with threats and phrases claiming that he was some important person, and he tried to find out if our hero knew who he was. But the young man didn't listen to him. The man took the microphone. He wrapped the cord from the microphone around the man's neck, while the man tried to say something but was drastically lacking air. Having wrapped the cord around the man's neck, our hero threw the microphone far away. With this action, he lifted the man in the red suit above the stage, using all his strength. The man tried to break free because he was seconds away from death. Our hero ordered him to answer all his questions, and only after that, he would release him. Sitting nearby, he held the microphone in his hand and continued to talk about the drugs, the contraband they had been dealing with. Then he turned on a dictaphone. Meanwhile, the man still tried to free himself. Our hero pitied the people who were dealing with contraband they kept in an underground vault. Then he asked for the code to the safe. All this time, he stared intently at the man. Then, politely urging him to hurry up before he suffocated, the man, gasping for breath, started stuttering and repeating the numbers one after another. Our hero recorded all the words spoken on the dictaphone during this time. All these actions didn't seem to evoke any emotions in him. It was as if he had no heart at all. After hearing everything, he dropped the microphone, and the man in the red suit fell to the stage with a crash. While the man in the red suit tried to free himself from the cord and massage his neck from strangulation, Hale thanked him nonchalantly. And then, within a second, he turned his head and saw the barrel of a gun in front of him. He had nothing left but to smile. Click, and his head exploded into small pieces. After the act, our hero took out a cigarette from a pack. The room was littered with corpses. Some were just lying there, while others... Our hero was about to light up when he heard some unknown apologies coming from an unknown source. He tried to figure out what it was and where it came from. It was the blindfolded boy, who had already taken off the blindfold and peeked out from behind the chair, looking directly at our hero, asking if he came for him, if they came to rescue him. But barely paying attention to the boy, Hale lit his cigarette and said that he did not come for him. Sitting by the drum, smoking his cigarette, he repeated that saving people was not his thing. The whole scene resembled some sort of performance. The light falling on the stage, our hero sitting and looking into the distance while smoking a cigarette, and the scattered bodies. It looked like an interesting idea for a spectacle. The sound of perfume spray. A row of skincare products from one brand. A set on the keyboard. When arranged, the first letters of the words formed the name of the cigarette brand, Marlboro. Our hero was already sitting at his desk and trying to do something. Suddenly, there was a cry next to him, but he didn't care much as he looked too tired and tormented. Standing right above him, the enraged girl who turned out to be the team leader addressed him by name, Marin Lane. She yelled, trying to find out if he knew what time it was and where he had been all morning. Marin Lane screamed and screamed, but the boy didn't even look at her, completely ignoring her. She kept on screaming, almost losing her voice, then tried to understand if he was going to say anything or keep silent. Finally, the boy glanced at the girl, but it seemed there was no hint of regret in his eyes. He didn't care. A moment later, he languidly said that he just went out to smoke. The girl was furious. Or rather, she was beyond furious. She was furious beyond measure. But after that, she tried to understand if he was joking, and then she started asking how he could be so shameless. During this time, the phone rang. The girl, addressing our hero, said that she had already told him more than once. The phone kept ringing, but no one paid attention to it. The girl repeated that if he continued to treat work this way. She didn't finish her sentence as she was already boiling with anger, and even closed her eyes from it. And then, taking a deep breath, the girl screamed so loudly that the entire office heard her, begging someone to finally pick up the phone. But everyone was too calm and busy with their work. However, the guy with pink hair, distracted from his tasks, picked up the phone. Next, the girl made sure that work was going full steam ahead and tried to remember where she had left off. Our hero teased her by quoting her last phrase from the scream to him, "If you continue to treat work this way." Marin Lane, as if awakening, stopped screaming. She repeated that this couldn't go on. She tried to understand if he heard the phone ringing just now, but our hero looked at her so calmly that it irritated her even more. Ignoring what the girl was saying, the young man took the phone in his hands and started examining something there. The young lady repeated wearily that they were swamped with work, and our hero constantly went out to smoke and wouldn't return for hours. On the phone, it was visible that it was already 4:37 p.m., and there was a new message saying that new smoke goods had arrived. The girl, seeing the young man's behavior, asked if he was listening. At that moment, our hero started to get up. The girl slumped even more due to Hale's actions, and she desperately began to ask where he was going, as he had a lot of work planned for today. The young man grabbed a blue folder. After that, he stated that he would just go out for a smoke. Taking the folder without saying anything, he started to put on his jacket, while a colleague sitting nearby admired the young man's behavior. Without much thought, he turned around and started to leave, and all the people present were just watching what was happening. A moment later, one of the colleagues asked the girl, who was flipping through the report that our hero had handed her before leaving, why they didn't just fire him. As she was leaving, the girl said that Hale was really good at what he does. But it seems the guy with pink hair didn't understand the answer. The girl, enthusiastically going through the whole report, started to repeat with excitement that he was a true individualist, but did his job too well. Next, the actions will take place on one of the streets of the megapolis, where everyone is always in a rush. Our hero was already inhaling nicotine. As he smoked a cigarette on the street, he pondered that it was time to get back to work. But what work was that? And what was he planning in general? We will find out very, very soon. Now, everything will happen to you at one of the government meetings. A man stands in front of a screen, and several people listen to him. This man was in his uniform, starting his dialogue with the fact that everyone now lives in the era of criminal cartels. Day and night, they trade in human trafficking and organs. The drugs they push onto the market ensure an endless flow of addicts who have no choice but to turn to the criminal world to satisfy their thirst. As a result, they fall into the cauldron that lured them into this trap. In our time, it is impossible to distinguish an innocent citizen from a cartel member in anything. Sooner or later, this city will become nothing more than a breeding ground for vice. One cannot rely on a soft, lawful approach. And then this man went on to say that they must destroy all of them to the last one. This is their last chance to cleanse this place. One of the men on the screen spoke up, saying that they are smart enough to hide their tracks and evade investigation. They won't be able to find legal grounds for their arrest until they start acting. Therefore, the authorities cannot use brute force first. Looking at the compass, this man continued, stating that this is especially true concerning the organization at the center of it all. At the moment, HEPA is trying to emerge from the shadows. The man who said all this and walked along the room was trying to address the mayor, governor, and president. Then he said that he would like to offer them a solution to all their problems. He suggests creating an unofficial target group, a squad of suicide bombers, a team of talented agents who have personally suffered at the hands of the cartels. They thirst for revenge. And most importantly, they carry out the mission no matter what. Standing at the end of the negotiating table, this man continued, saying that they should support them by providing information and weapons, as well as sponsoring them, discreetly, of course. Then he suggested disguising the coordination point as an ordinary establishment. Just at that moment, our hero entered the establishment. The cheerful bartender behind the bar greeted him happily and suggested he come in quickly. The room was bright and spacious. After Hale sat at the bar counter, the bartender affirmatively said that he came earlier than expected, and that's great. He really wants to give this to you as soon as possible. Remembering the red-haired girl and how she shouted, our hero said that he had to leave. The bartender began to run around the counter and seemed to be looking for something while saying that for some reason, the boss chose a decent brand of cigarettes this time. He knows that our hero constantly complains about being given bad cigarettes. A moment later, the bartender opened a drawer with all the necessary weapons and a pack of cigarettes. And this bartender is not as simple as he seems at first glance. Taking out a cigarette from the pack, the young man started examining it and realized that it was a classic one. The colorful pack seemed somewhat unusual. Our hero pondered that these cigarettes had a strong, slightly suffocating, smoky smell, but their delicate charm balanced out this drawback. The bartender looked even more kindly. Then he continued, saying that he thinks our hero will like them, and after a little thought, added that these cigarettes suit him better than anyone else. Our hero took one cigarette. Something was written there, and the bartender continued to say that besides all this, the boss also gave him the coordinates. But he said he didn't need them, as he already knows everything. Approaching the shelf with cigarettes, the bartender pointed to a specific type and asked how many packs he would take this time, and then asked if one pack would be enough for him. Our hero didn't respond to that, just looking at him with a longing look. After some thought and looking at the ashtray, he said he would take the whole box. After all, cigarettes are usually supplied in boxes, either 10 packs, 200 cigarettes, or 20 packs, 400 cigarettes. The bartender muttered to himself that he hasn't changed at all. Our hero recalled how they handed him a pack of cigarettes and said that he would receive instructions through them. They strongly advised him not to actually smoke them. Sitting at the table facing each other, the interlocutor of our hero continued to develop his thought, stating that the smell of cigarettes at the crime scene could become evidence leading to our hero. With his hand mostly covered in bandages, our hero started to take the pack and said that all these prohibitions only make him want to smoke these cigarettes even more. And just as he lit one cigarette from the pack, Hale interrupted the conversation about it because no one knows when he'll kick the bucket. Wiping the plate, the bartender advised our hero to take care of himself. In the office, the redhead girl sat pensively and thought to herself. She saw that it was already 38 minutes past 7, so she assumed that our hero wasn't going to come back. Therefore, she decided that this time she would definitely fire him. She didn't notice how the colleague standing next to her tried to call her. She was still thinking about who he thought he was. After all, she can always hire someone else. Her requirements are minimal, basic manners. The girl even shed a tear. She still hadn't heard that they were trying to call her. She was pondering, what difference does it make if he's good-looking and good at what he does? She can't work with such a person, so why force herself? In one chapter, during the girl's musings, the colleague started shouting her name. This action terrified the girl, and she even screamed, her hair standing on end. The young man, looking like a freak, stared at her motionless and then began to speak, saying that he didn't mean to scare her. He just couldn't get through to her. The girl started apologizing and said that she was just lost in thought. And then the frightened girl regained her composure and asked what he was doing here, calling this young man Jaden. Isn't he supposed to be at the meeting with clients, discussing the surveillance camera menu? They stood facing each other, and the guy said that something happened, and at that moment, his phone rang. Naturally, this young man picked up the receiver and said it was Jane Merle. Then he asked who this was, and after a while, this guy started to justify himself. He talked about how they understand that he lost the file with all the information about their company. Then, someone asked him why he was 2 hours late. After all, it sounds terrible. Hearing all this, Marion Lane was horrified and started asking how he could have lost the file and didn't call anyone to warn them that he wouldn't come. At first, Jaden didn't understand the essence of the question. Then he innocently said that he just didn't call. Yeah, it happened. He didn't think about it. He was too nervous. Then he asked if the girl was angry. At this time, all the employees began to tidy up their workstations, saying it was time to go home and saying goodbye to each other. The guy tried to calm the girl down, saying that she shouldn't be mad at him. He'll try his best, and he'll definitely learn a lesson from it. The girl was horrified, and she didn't know what to do. She grabbed her hair and stared at the ceiling. At the same time, she asked how she could kill this employee. It's very funny, because at that moment, he asks the same question. Only if the girl's anger will quickly pass, our hero is completely serious about it. Looking at the face of a person who clearly feared the consequences, he started to say that perhaps he couldn't even imagine what would happen, and then he called him Peter. Our hero stood atop this person and, placing the gun against his open mouth, began to speak, saying that he could barely recognize him because he gained weight. He must have been eating well while our hero was away. Peter tried to understand where he came from because he heard that Hale was dead. Taking a cigarette from the pack, our hero confidently told Peter that it's his long-standing weakness. Asserting further, he said that Peter easily believes in things he hasn't seen with his own eyes. For example, promises of rewards. At this point, the gun was already pressed against Peter's temple, and our hero continued to speak, saying that Peter also believes in the glory he will receive by taking our hero's place. And as he pulled the trigger of the gun, he said that they would definitely meet in hell. But the guy tried to stop him. Stammering, he said it wasn't him. Yes, he invited our hero there on that day, but looking at Hale's outlines, Peter continued to speak, assuring him that he couldn't kill her, calling her Ricky. And recalling the girl's outlines, he called her by her name. It was his fatal mistake. Our hero's eyes turned furious. He covered Peter's mouth with one hand and pointed the gun at his face with the other. He started firing bullets one after another. There was no living spot left on his face. It was just a mess. The guy turned around and ordered him not to dare to utter that girl's name. After a moment, the door opened, and another guy entered, calling Ricky's name again. Our hero clearly didn't expect such a turn of events. He looked at the entrance door. Our hero's face was completely covered in blood. This guy started running through the alleys of Megapolis. As he ran, he shouted, and it seemed like he heard Peter saying Ricky. The guy never missed a target. Then, turning around, he asked aloud if he managed to escape. But he didn't see that our hero was standing right in front of him. And in a moment, our hero had already lifted this young man by the neck above himself. The guy was terrified. This guy was the cartel's best killer. Hale wearily said that he hates playing hide-and-seek. Marion Lane was typing something on her phone. She was typing a message to Hale. In the message, she asked if he would return to the office today because she wanted to ask if he planned to work late in the evening. Leaving the building, the girl closed the door with one hand and held her phone in the other. At that moment, she wished him a good day. But the young lady was tired and thought to herself that she would really love if the day turned out to be good. The girl started thinking about something. She put her hand on her head and directed her gaze somewhere. Then she looked at her phone screen again, specifically at the message she typed to our hero, and realized that she shouldn't send it. But she had already sent a message from her to him, asking where our hero was. She tried to retype something and asked for help from an unknown person. Closing her eyes, she thought, if only our hero could magically appear right in front of me. Walking past the alley, she heard some noises and naturally turned all her attention there. In that alley lay the body of the young man whom our hero had lifted before. Now his head was smashed, and there was blood everywhere, and our hero was just sitting over the body. When Hale realized that someone was watching him, he jumped up and pointed the gun. Our hero and the directed gun were reflected in the girl's pupils. She thought he really appeared out of nowhere, as it seemed to her. They stood on either side of the young man's body. Our hero looked at her, pointing the gun. Marion Lane watched in horror the entire scene, and she could only utter his name. And what happens next, we will find out in the next chapter. The guy twisted the girl's hands behind her back and pressed on her with his hands. The girl tried to call our hero and tell him that he had blood on his face. Hale was confidently leading Marion Lane somewhere and said that it's not his blood. Due to her high heels, the girl wasn't walking fast, but our hero wasn't rushing either. As he walked, he thought about how terrible the day was. They approached the body of the killed young man, who was still making some sounds, and possibly he could still be helped. Looking at this scene, the girl assumed that this guy was severely wounded, so she suggested calling an ambulance. But our hero, hearing this, pulled out a gun instead of a phone, as the red-haired girl thought. He began to shoot bullets one after another into this already definitely dead guy. The girl started screaming, but our hero kept her in his grip while firing. The girl was terrified. She opened her eyes even wider, and there were many questions in her head. For example, where did he get the gun? Or did he just kill him? Seriously? Is this really the Hale she knows? Then, somehow, the girl managed to break free from our hero's grip, and while doing so, she screamed for him to let her go. The girl ran to some fence and fearfully asked Hale not to approach her. Then she began to assure that she didn't see anything. But the guy was resolute and started reloading the gun, saying that she saw everything. The girl tried to appear calm and even smiled while saying that she wouldn't tell anyone and promised to forget everything. Our hero was too cruel, so he aimed the gun at her and said that he didn't believe her. The girl thought, is this how I'll die? On the way back to work after buying a snack? At the hands of someone she considered a colleague? Is this really the worst day ever? The girl tried to convince the guy not to kill her, asking him to think about the time they spent together. She even mentioned that she had positive feelings towards him, and they were in good terms. Kneeling before our hero, she pleaded not to kill her because she didn't want to die like this. Hale looked at all this with some horror and even recalled something. He remembered phrases that the deceased girl said before she received a bullet in her head. She was also begging for help back then. Our hero was already in a state of shock or even despair. He definitely didn't know what to do next. He was about to pull the trigger when someone called the girl's name. It was a colleague with whom she went out for a snack. He was walking and calling her name. As he walked, he wondered where she might have gone and how it happened that her phone wasn't answering. He realized that he was already very close to the alley where our hero and the girl were. Hale started hesitating. Standing before the girl, he finally began to speak, saying that he's giving her exactly one chance. The young lady was shocked. She jumped up and started thanking him enthusiastically. But our hero just stood and watched. The young man was still in place, and the red-haired girl already started shouting that she would go, but she didn't notice how she began to run. Looking at the spreading pool of blood, the girl asked our hero to finish his business. At that moment, the young man overheard a dialogue between his colleagues. The guy asked the girl what she was doing in that alley, as he was looking for her. The girl replied with gratitude and offered him to eat her corn dog. The guy agreed. All this was nerve-wracking for our hero, and he reached for a cigarette in his jacket pocket. Then he started looking around. Jaden was already standing and nibbling on something. All these people were already in the office, including our hero. Addressing the girl, the young man asked if she wasn't going to eat anything, to which she replied that she wasn't feeling well and offered him to eat everything himself. This news pleased the guy greatly. The girl looked around and couldn't understand why he was working. And in general, how was it possible after everything that happened? And our hero sat at his workstation, typing something on the keyboard, paying no attention to anything else. He was too focused. While the girl was thinking about all of this, he turned to the guy who saved Marion Lane and said he found the missing customer data and had just sent it to him. The girl became worried and thanked him while staring at her monitor. As she looked through the files he sent, the girl realized he was a very competent and intimidating employee. After that, she told him he did a good job. Jaden approached our hero's workstation and asked how he found the data. He replied that he had backup copies of everything he uploaded last week. The young man asked about the backups. Afterward, he stood up from his desk and said he would go smoke. The girl was a bit scared seeing that. But a second later, she enthusiastically began stuttering, telling him to go ahead and smoke as much as he needed. As he left, he said he would be back very soon. The girl watched him leave and waited for the moment the door would close. A chill ran down her spine, and she was already looking at everything in horror. The girl realized this was her chance, and she needed to run away from this place as quickly as possible. She hurriedly started gathering her things, not noticing how terrible and ridiculous it looked from the outside. Her savior saw this scene, so he asked if she was going home. The girl was flustered and said she had urgent matters to attend to. Besides, she had to call all the clients tomorrow anyway. She didn't even finish the sentence before she started saying something else. The young lady turned to Jaden, who clearly didn't understand what she wanted from him. Stuttering, she asked if he could hose. And then she fell silent. It was as if something jerked her back, and she thought that no, she couldn't involve anyone in what happened. So, as she ran away, she shouted for him to forget everything and that Jaden could also go home. Entering her apartment, she locked the door with all possible locks. She closed the curtains. And standing by the window, she reasoned aloud about locking the door and all the windows. Everything is fine. It's safe here. But the girl was too scared, and it prevented her from even letting go of the curtains. Looking at her cozy apartment, she pondered what the hell was happening. She remembered our hero with a gun, and holding her head, she realized she couldn't think clearly. After putting on her home slippers, the young lady started speaking aloud, saying it was always difficult to understand our hero, but she never considered him a bad person. From behind her, she heard the phrase that he really was a bad person. It was our hero. She looked in horror. And there they stood in her apartment, facing each other, staring intently into each other's eyes. Hale looked too grim. So, what's going to happen? We'll find out in the next chapter. Leaving the office and standing right at the entrance, our hero started making a call to someone. While waiting for an answer, he managed to light a cigarette. And when someone finally picked up, he asked what to do if civilian noticed him. The person he called was from the city police. He was sitting in a chair and shuffling through some papers, and upon hearing the question, he wondered how he could make such a mistake. It didn't seem like something he would do. This man thought for a moment and said he was afraid that the greater good required sacrifices. Our hero didn't like this answer at all. He even forgot about his cigarette. After hanging up, he saw the red-haired girl rushing at an insane speed somewhere. The word eliminate was spinning in his head. Meanwhile, the girl was still running without looking back. But our hero called back and asked if he should eliminate her, even if it's Marion Lane. And there they stood, facing each other in the girl's apartment. She looked at him in horror and didn't understand what was happening. Looking into our hero's eyes, she seemed to echo Hale's words, saying that he promised not to kill her. The guy started walking towards the young lady, and he reached out straight at her. With tears in her eyes, the girl began to scream that it's the end for her. But the guy just took a bunch of keys from her hair and they jingled, but the girl didn't stop screaming, and instead, she started defending herself with some movements. And a moment later, our hero asked her where she came up with the idea that he came to kill her. The girl clearly didn't expect such a turn of events, and she looked at him less scared, but still kept screaming. Looking at her and holding the bunch of keys in his hand, he asked if he ever lied to her. The girl, who was already relieved, thought that he really wouldn't kill her. But was she safe? Then she just thanked him. After her short-lived relief, the girl noticed his hand with the bunch of keys and became indignant, asking why he needed them. It was her house keys. The guy stood calmly and just looked. Then he said he would live with her. The girl was horrified and couldn't understand how this was possible. As he was leaving, the guy said he needed to keep an eye on her. Then he asked if she had a spare room. The girl was too outraged. Perhaps that's why she couldn't say anything to him. While our hero was opening the entrance door, Marion Lane asked what he was even talking about and how it all came to this. Then she said she wouldn't allow anything like that, and that it's her home. As our hero left, he said there was nothing to worry about. If she chooses death, he won't dissuade her. Not getting any response, he said that since they made an agreement, he would go smoke. The terrified girl watched Hale leave, unable to respond to such a statement. Then, falling to her knees out of helplessness, the girl wondered if he spared her or condemned her to death. She kept sobbing and echoing about the spare room, but she didn't have a spare room. After a few moments, she pondered and was distracted from her tears. She moved towards some place where there was clearly a mess. It was a storage room. It was too cluttered, so it couldn't be considered a spare room. The girl looked too desperate, not understanding what to do next. On the road in the Megapolis, the traffic light was red, which meant that the traffic had temporarily stopped. Cars stood still, waiting for the green light. Music was playing in one of the cars. A man sat on the back seat, tapping his foot and talking about how his life had changed dramatically. He looked very tired. His hands were deep in his pockets. He talked about how he tore apart anything and everything, doing any task. Even the driver saw all the actions of this person in the rearview mirror. In particular, he shook his head and continued talking about how he received nothing in return. Next, the guy began to protest, "Where the hell is Peter? Damn life." He frowned in dissatisfaction. The driver said he understood him very well. It seemed to amuse the guy, and he asked if the driver was joking. Then he continued speaking. What can he know? He's just turning the wheel. Meanwhile, someone hit the driver in the front seats. At this moment, something was happening in the front seats, and the guy sitting in the back, unaware of it, told the driver not to pretend he understood what was being said and ordered him to drive. But he didn't notice that our hero had already approached the open window. This guy grabbed him by the throat. He gripped his face, causing drool to spill out. Now the driver couldn't see what was happening behind, so he started saying that maybe he's just a driver, but he spent the last decades working for HEP 2, so he understands what he lacks. Then he said that HEP 2 used to be much better before. The man sitting in the back didn't understand and even asked again. The driver turned around, looking too frightened. His eyes started twitching, and he tried to ask something. Looking straight at our hero, who was smoking a cigarette, he called him Ricky, as several people before him did. He confirmed it. Hale recalled that when the bartender handed cigarettes to our hero, he took one and asked him to look at it. After the name Peter Cruz, there was a plus alpha. The bartender advised him to try harder. After that, an unexpected bonus awaits him. And now, sitting in the back seat, he thought that it was indeed a bonus. While smoking a cigarette, he mentioned the name of his deceased girlfriend, and then, turning to the driver, said that she had always been very kind to him, wasn't it? Remembering the moment when she asked Hale to greet her, he approached the driver and said that it's Mr. Johnson, the best driver in the world. The driver stood there, looking embarrassed and scratching his head. The girl looked very happy. After that memory, our hero turned to the driver again and asked why he betrayed her. The driver started to stutter but couldn't find an answer to such a question. Pointing the gun at his shoulder, our hero ordered him to drive, and they talked on the way. The driver was clearly not thrilled. He was scared. Later, our hero added that he should be careful. Hale looked too angrily. The driver was in a panic. The guy called him the driver of the year. Meanwhile, the red-haired girl, with a sense of satisfaction, said, "Finished." In the former storage room, there was a real room. Everything as it should be, a bed, a nightstand, and very bright. The girl sat in the middle of the bed. She understood that now it was clean enough for our hero not to kill her. Then she imagined how he would reproach her for allocating him the storage room, and she leaves. And while looking out the window, the smile on the girl's face faded slightly. It already seemed like deep night outside. The moon, with white dots scattered around the dark sky. She wondered when he would come back and if he would return today at all. At the same time, our hero was driving in the car and looking at the sky while smoking a cigarette. They were driving somewhere unknown, but where exactly they were going, we will find out in the next chapter. These two arrived in some forest. Our hero pushed the driver in front of him, who pleaded for him to listen. Placing his hands on his temples, the man started saying that he had no choice. He had to take care of his family. No one will look after them if he dies. He then went on to say that they threatened his family, and at that moment, our hero kicked the driver to the ground ahead. Hale seemed uninterested in this babbling. After all, he was exceptionally good at his job. The man fell with a crash. The young man asked about his deceased girlfriend. Then he asserted that the driver knew they would kill her if he brought her there. Looking at the chauffeur, our hero continued trying to understand how he couldn't know. After all, according to his words, the driver had been working for HEP 2 for the last 10 years. The man tried to justify himself, saying that the girl was alone, while he had 5 in his family, including himself. Was he supposed to sacrifice 5 lives for one? He begged, saying our hero was still young and could always find someone else. As our hero loaded the gun, he was losing patience. He tried to figure out what the driver ultimately meant. Standing over him, he guessed that the man was saying he was innocent. Looking at him, the man tried to defend himself, but it didn't go well. He mentioned some new woman leader and claimed it was her order. Our hero had no idea about the new leader, so he began asking about her. The driver said he never saw her personally, but then he really got cornered. He even said that anyone, even our hero, would have done the same. And at that moment, a shot rang out, and the bullet hit the man's hand. Hale heard enough. Meanwhile, the man cried out in pain. Approaching the crouched body of the driver, our hero asked if he wanted him to go to someone else, right? It was the funniest thing he heard all year. The driver begged for mercy. Our hero replied that he appreciates Johnson's care. Then he said that in gratitude, he might give him a chance to survive. In an instant, he drew a line on the ground with his boot. He said that the driver shouldn't cross that line, so if his actions were really justified, he was sure that God wouldn't turn away from him. These words and our hero's actions shocked the driver. Screaming in pain, he tried to stand up, and as he ran away from our hero, he tried to shout that he did the right thing. He was not guilty. At that moment, the gun was aimed straight at the man's back. All this amused the young man. His weapon was already aimed at the target. In a moment, shots rang out in the silence of the night. Approaching one of the doors, our hero tried to break in. From behind the door emerged the bartender who had given our hero the cigarettes with goals. He looked too sleepy and didn't understand what was happening. Seeing our hero, he said his name and asked what he was doing there at such an hour. Ignoring his questions, our hero asked his own and specifically inquired if there was something he didn't know. This question plunged the bartender into a kind of shock, so he asked what was going on. Hale heard that Hep 2 had a new leader, a female leader. Such words were definitely not expected by the man in the middle of the night, and I doubt he was ever prepared to hear them from our hero. Walking up to the bar counter, our hero began to say that, according to the instructions, he must give him a special mission if he asks about it. The young man sitting behind the bar counter said he didn't understand anything. Then, wearily looking into the distance, he started saying that Hep 2 was strictly a family business. Leadership positions were distributed among blood relatives, and he was absolutely sure that all the women among them died in the last struggle for power. The bartender, doing something at the cabinets, agreed with him. Then he said that they had learned it not long ago, too. He was just as confused as our hero. In general, the management said that they need to dig deep into her. Taking out a pack of cigarettes, the man said that the investigation would take time since it was new to everyone. Meanwhile, he had a job for him. But there's one catch. After that, the bartender seemed to hesitate. Looking at our hero, he finally mustered the courage and said that he would have to save someone. But our hero immediately refused. The bartender clearly expected this and said that in that case, he was obliged to inform him that he wouldn't get any new information. Extinguishing the cigarette in the ashtray, our hero became indignant because once again, they were giving him a job that wasn't in his profile. After all, he only kills people. He hasn't saved a single soul. And he asked the bartender to convey that he would rather double the number of killings. At that moment, his phone rang. It was his alarm. Almost immediately, he turned it off. The bartender inquired where he was going after all. Our hero calmly replied that he was in a hurry to work. One of his colleagues asked if he was going there just like that, in his current state. Our hero echoed the last word, and indeed, his clothes were stained with the blood of the killed driver. Entering the workplace, he said that he was stuck in traffic. By then, Marin Lane was already sitting at her desk and was slightly shocked to see our hero. Did he show up? The killer, who disappeared somewhere after making her clean his room all night, finally came to work. The girl was furious. But looking at our hero, she was already slightly shocked, as was Jaden standing next to her. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. All the colleagues who were already at work were puzzled as well. Our hero was dressed too attractively. His suit and cloak were in light tones, just like his shirt. These shades suited him very well and emphasized everything that could be emphasized. His bright hair and eyes harmoniously complemented the light business attire. From time to time, the girl peered out from behind her desk and looked at our hero. The idea of wearing the suit came from the bartender. Someone called the guy, and he looked tiredly. It was his colleagues who came to ask him for help. A man in a green suit and glasses handed him a piece of paper, saying it needed to be done by the end of the day. And a red-haired girl handed him a yellow folder and asked him to do it too, since he's here. Our hero didn't respond, and Marin Lane was thinking that maybe all the guys had gone crazy. You can't just dump all your work on Hale like that. At one point, the girl was horrified, thinking, what if he gets angry and starts killing everyone here? Well, she did go to extremes, of course. But still, this thought gave her chills. The young man started working, holding a cup of coffee in one hand. And at one point, another coworker approached him and asked if he could make a copy since he was already up. He handed him a piece of paper and smiled kindly. Our hero didn't say anything in response, just looked at the coworker in confusion. His eye began to twitch. The girl was horrified because she expected something terrible. And at one point, she flew at our hero. Flying at him, she tore the paper that their colleague had just handed him, saying she'd better make the photocopy. In doing so, she didn't notice how the cup of coffee spilled onto our hero's light-colored shirt. And now the coffee splashed on his light shirt. The young man grabbed the girl's wrist to prevent her from falling, but she asked if he was all right. And there they stood, holding onto each other, looking into each other's eyes. Well, what will happen next? We'll find out soon. A few hours earlier, our hero was engrossed in something. At that time, a red-haired girl was watching him. A man in a green suit entered the room and, turning to our hero, asked him to order coffee as they had run out of it. Our hero immediately agreed, But upon hearing this, Marin Lane raised her hand and enthusiastically said that she would do it herself. Our hero was puzzled, observing this scene. Sometime later, during work, someone asked the guy to pick up the phone, to which our hero again agreed. But before he could respond, the girl answered and started talking to the client. In one of the rooms, our hero was searching for something. And there, all of a sudden, Marin appeared. She immediately asked Hale what he was looking for. The guy replied that he was looking for information about installing additional phones in the hospital. The girl scratched her head and said that all that information was with her. Observing this scene, their colleagues couldn't understand what was happening with their boss today. After Marin said that all the necessary information for our hero was with her, she cheerfully said that she would take care of it and asked him not to worry. Our hero was clearly not pleased with such overprotectiveness. At the moment, our hero was still holding the girl by the wrist. Addressing her as Miss Lane, he said that it was his job. So he took the paper from the girl, who was clearly shocked by this behavior. Glancing at him, the girl agreed and stepped back. As she walked away, she thought that she was just trying to help, but he seemed to get angry for some reason. She was a bit offended and didn't understand why it was happening, and the young man was already going somewhere, most likely to sort out his work matters. Approaching Jaden, he handed him the paper. He was definitely shocked. Our hero did what this young man asked, so after the paper was in his hands, he thanked Hale. The red-haired girl sitting nearby asked our hero why he didn't let Marin Lane do the work he was going to do. After all, she offered herself. But our hero couldn't come up with an answer to that. But after a while, he asked, "Is it so pleasant to dump your work on others and enjoy yourself?" She obviously didn't expect that and got a little upset. Well, it's not surprising. She couldn't spread any rumors. Getting angry, she started lecturing our hero that he talks as if he does all the work himself, when, in reality, he's no better than her. Hale paid her no attention, and as he started leaving, the girl shouted after him that he was being too insolent. Meanwhile, Marin Lane was sitting at her desk, trying to do something, but it was all just darkness around. Entering her apartment, the girl changed her shoes, slammed her bag on the floor, turned on the light, and sighed. The girl staggered to another room, muttering about how tired she was while trying to find the switch. Turning on the light, she saw a young man sitting with his head down on her couch. He asked her to behave as usual, even saying please. The young man was obviously as tired as she was. Hale asked her to behave naturally. The girl standing nearby was in some kind of horror and started to say something incomprehensible. But after gathering herself, she said that she's trying her best, as saying it is easier than doing it, and then hoped for the young man's understanding. Our hero looked intently at the red-haired girl, and the girl was looking at him with her big green eyes. Our hero slowly stood up from the couch. He began to talk about how last week, the week before last, and even long before he started working at Maryland Networks, he spent a long time killing people for countless reasons. The girl standing nearby was shocked. She wondered if she should praise him for it, but she could only answer that she understood. Next, the guy began to talk about how he saved her life while approaching the girl, who was clearly in complete terror. Leaning towards her face, he asked if she supposed why he saved her life. The girl had no idea what to answer, so after a little while, she asked why he saved her life. Was there any reason? She had a desperate look. Then she asked again, what was the reason? But our hero just looked at her and said nothing. He was about to say something, but something stopped him. He turned around and said he was going to bed, leaving the girl with a head full of questions. The girl didn't understand what that was. Wasn't he going to finish his speech? She could only watch the guy leave. She shouted after him, but he had already closed the door. He stood in a fully tidied room and was shocked. Remembering what happened in this room not long ago, he concluded that the girl had cleaned it up. Then he noticed a plush teddy bear standing next to the bed. He took it in his hand. Shifting it from one hand to the other, he started examining the teddy bear. The guy recalled his conversation when Marin Lane's fate was decided. He was told to get rid of her. The man hesitated, so he said that killing her now would be too wasteful. He asked to find another way for our hero. Placing the plush bear back where he found it, The guy came to the conclusion that all of this was still a mess. In her room, the girl was trying to understand the reason for being alive. She was sitting and rubbing her cheeks, trying to figure out what it could be. And sitting on her bed, kicking off her slippers, she came to the conclusion that it doesn't matter anymore. He left her alive, and that's good enough. She took her laptop in her hands and yawned. She had another question of life and death. The girl began to open her laptop. Remembering the incident, her colleagues waited for 2 hours at the meeting. She needed to find other clients, and quickly. The girl was determined. She decided that she would acquire a new client no matter what, even if she had to knock on every door in the city. Her eyes were burning with determination. She knew that if someone responded to her emails, she would go through all circles of hell to get the final agreement. She would even swim through a swamp with alligators if necessary. The girl had already set off somewhere. Such was her determination. She couldn't even imagine that she would end up in such a place. There were some vagrant people around her, resembling drug addicts. She walked, and all eyes were on her. The girl passed by a person who clearly didn't feel well and seemed to be experiencing some drug withdrawal. The young girl was trying to understand where she ended up, and she was feeling uneasy. Some graffiti were visible in a puddle, but what will happen next? We'll find out in the next chapter.